So the second half of the book of Exodus, almost the second half, there's five portions that discuss the Mishkan, the temple that the Jewish people built in the desert. There's two portions that discuss the commandment of Hashem, how to build it, the commandment of God, the way God tells Moses the way it should be done. And then there's another portion that sort of talks some more of the details, and then you have the stories of the golden calf and the second tablets. And then another two portions where everything's repeated, where Moshe tells to the people what God commanded, and then again how how the people actually did it. So obviously, there's a lot of emphasis on this story of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, which is a little bit unusual because it's not something that really there's not a lot of plot there. That's for one, but also it doesn't the commandment to build a Mishkan does not apply to all times. In other words, yes, we built a home for God in Jerusalem, and in some ways there are certain similarities, but many of the specifics of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, of the temple in the desert were actually different than the temple in Jerusalem. So they're building a temporary structure, and half of the book focuses on this idea of building this temple. So there's certainly a lot of attention given to this, and the question is how come? And the answer is there are many answers. There's so many ways to look at it, and we're looking for significance both in the big ideas and in the specifics of every vessel, of every detail. So we can talk about this forever. And there's different ways of reading it. There's Kabbalistic ways of reading it, that the temple represents the human being or time. There's so many ways to look at it. But one way to begin, just one way to begin, is just the concept that the name of this week's parsha. The name of this week's parsha is Eila Pekudei HaMishkan, Mishkan HaEdut. This is the accounting of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the tabernacle of testimony. And the word Pekudei means the counting, because after they build the temple, they count and they give in an accounting of all the materials that are used. You hire a contractor, and they tell you, and they usually run over budget, and they usually tell you that they spent too much money. So here, Moshe gives an accounting of exactly all the materials they used. But then there is the idea that the Mishkan, the temple, is referred to as Mishkan HaEdut, the tabernacle of testimony. And the question, and what is it a testimony? Like we know that the tablets that contain the Ten Commandments are referred to in the Torah as Luchot HaEdut, the tablets of testimony. And there is now all of a sudden the temple is called the Temple of Testimony, the Mishkan, the Tabernacle of Testimony. So that's an interesting thing right in the beginning of the parsha. What is this testimony? What does it mean? What does it refer to? And how is the temple a testimony? What is it testifying to? Now, testimony is also a broad topic, because the Jewish people are also referred to as God's witnesses. There is a verse that says in Isaiah, Atem Eidai, you, the Jewish people, are God's witnesses. In other words, our mandate is to tell the story, to testify about the existence of God. So we are witnesses. There's a beautiful commentary that we may have said before, that if you look at Shema, so the statement Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel, so you have this mitzvah to say it twice a day. Now, if you look at the Torah and you look at the Shema, there are two letters in the sentence of Shema that are unusual, because you have the ayin in Shema, the final letter of the first word, Shema. The ayin is a large letter. In the Torah, it's a large letter. And the Dalid, Hashem Echad, God is one, the Dalid also is a large Dalid. So in one sentence, you have two large letters. And if you put these two large letters together, you get the word aid, witness. So in other words, when we declare the oneness of God, we are acting as witnesses of Hashem in this world. So that's a broad subject of what witnesses is, what a witness is, and what testimony is. But going back to the temple, temple we refer to as the temple of testimony. And what does the temple testify? So Rashi quotes one medrash. The medrash says like this. The medrash says that this is testimony that God forgave the Jewish people for the sin of the golden calf. In other words, you would say, when the Jewish people sinned with the golden calf, which is a terrible betrayal, first two commandments is to believe in one God and not serve any idols. And only 40 days after God spoke to them directly, they violated the first two commandments, or at least some of them did. and they serve the golden calf. So this is a tremendous betrayal very early on in this relationship. And the Jewish people themselves are not sure if the relationship could survive this betrayal. And here, all of a sudden, God comes and says, you know what? Imagine a relationship and there's a betrayal. And then all of a sudden, God says, you know what? Let's build a home together. Let's build a home. So all of a sudden, when we start getting involved in this construction project and we start picking the colors and picking the furniture and picking the layout, and all of a sudden, every detail of the construction project, of the design and construction, it becomes very significant and very emotionally charged. Why? Because it's not just now we have a place to live, it's really an expression of the forgiveness. Because if God would not want, if God did not forgive the people, he would not want a home. A home is a place that symbolizes that God dwells amongst the people. So if you think about it in the metaphor, if there's betrayal, and then the couple decides, you know what, let's go build a home together. So it's not just a construction project. It's not just a renovation. It's not just an expansion. It's a very deep experience. And all of a sudden, every detail becomes important because it's not just a place that we're going to live and get together, but this is a place that expresses the profound power of the relationship, that the relationship could survive betrayal. So that is the first thing that Rashi says, Mishkan Edut, it's testimony. What is it testifying? Number one, it's testifying that God forgave the people for the sin of the golden calf. Go ahead, Dr. Bob, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. You know, we often see the wrath of God play out with Cain and Abel, with Adam, with Noah, with Nadav and Avihu. I mean, with Korach. I mean, he gets angry and he gets mad. Now, idol worship is one of the big three sins where you got to die. What about this, without really any tshuva? What about this incident led not only to his forgiveness, but a testimony, and let's build this thing together?
Okay, so there's a lot to think about. A lot to think about. Let's do this slow. I'm not saying I'm going to address every component. There's different angles, but let's just say let's start with the wrath. Let's start with the wrath for a moment. You say God, the Torah itself. It's not just we're describing God, but God Himself in the Ten Commandments refers to Himself as a jealous God. You know, somebody who's not going to just take the offense and accept it, but God is going to be quote unquote jealous, whatever that means. And jealous would mean exacting. So let's start with that, and then we'll talk about the forgiveness. So for one way to think about this, it's obviously a metaphor. God doesn't get angry like people get angry, but it's a metaphor for something deeper, right? All the metaphors in the Torah are metaphors just to help us understand, but it doesn't apply in the same way to God. But here's I think the way to think about jealous God. The opposite of jealousy would be what? Would be forgiving. But the idea here is if God says, look, we're in a relationship and I don't want you to serve idols because this is a relationship. And this is so important to me that if you violate this covenant, I'm going to be angry. I'm going to be jealous. I'm going to be angry. So what is that? What's the takeaway of that statement? So you could say, well, here we have an angry old man that can't control his temper. Okay, that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it, and certainly with God and the metaphor is, in other words, understanding it's just a metaphor, is that what God is saying is that this relationship matters to God. In other words, God is not apathetic about the betrayal, right? If you say, well, we're in a relationship, and if you betray, I don't mind. Okay, it doesn't mean necessarily that you're accepting. It could mean that you're forgiving. It could mean that. But if you're not offended, that means that this relationship is not important to you. And if you look at the etymology of the Hebrew word, the specific definition of kana, of jealousy, it's not like in English. That's why it's a bad translation. In English, jealousy means I want something that belongs to you, that belongs to somebody else. That's almost in the definition. I'm jealous of something, I do not have it, and somebody else has it. In that sense, God is not jealous. But if you look at the definition of the jealousy, the kana, in Hebrew, it's not, jealousy does not mean jealous of something that someone else has. Jealousy means protective. When you say I am jealous, you mean I'm protective of what is rightfully mine. So when God says, if you serve idols, I'm going to be angry, and I'm going to be upset, and I'm going to be jealous, and all those terms exist, and God is upset, in a way, you could say, well, God is just angry. Or you could say this is the greatest compliment to the people, because the first important thing is God cares. If God doesn't care, there's no relationship, right? It's just that we're there, we're doing what he says, but really it doesn't influence him, it doesn't connect to him. So that's a very important thing to think about. That the first thing is it has to matter, you know. The worst thing you could do to somebody is ignore somebody, right? Let's say my kid says something not nice to me and I ignore them because I don't. The kid is just trying to get your attention. The kid's trying to do something to show that you care. Ignoring, in a way, is the most hurtful thing. So God is saying, I'm not ignoring. God is saying, I'm angry. Angry means I've been violated. I've been violated means this is important to me. I became vulnerable, and this relationship is important to me. So that's beautiful. That's actually that's actually very romantic. So the jealousy is actually very romantic.
But
Now,
this is the same God that punishes and kills for what looks like much less.
correct. So we have to look at every case individually. But this idea of this is the sin of the golden calf as breaking of the marriage between God and the Jewish people, because that's what Sinai is supposed to be. Sinai is supposed to be a covenant of marriage, and so we understand why God is upset. But then there's another concept. The other concept is that the Talmud says, the Medrash says that really it's very strange that the Jewish people could sin so quickly after the golden calf. And the Medrash says, well, the question how to explain it exactly, but the point is that this story is God allows this to happen because God saw that this sin is brewing, right? It took at least a day for the people from when they had the idea to serve the golden calf till they actually served it. Because Aaron, if you remember the story, Aaron slows everybody down and he says, I'm going to make it myself. And he's an old man, so it takes a lot of time. By the time that the sun's about to set, and he says, you know what, tomorrow, let's do this tomorrow. And he delays them for a day, but he doesn't delay them long enough because they wake up early to sin. And by the time Moses comes, they already sinned. But the point here is, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say is God could have said Moses. God could have said to Moses, it's not 40 days yet, but the people are brewing this, the idol worship is brewing. Go down, let's stop this in its tracks. But God doesn't do it. So God in a way allows for it. So the Medrash says God allows for the sin in order to teach the people the power of repentance. In other words, that itself is the message. The message is not that the people were so terrible that they betrayed God. That's not the message. The message is that the bond between God and the Jewish people is so powerful that it could survive betrayal, or it could survive the tension. It could survive a difficulty. You have people who fall in love and they love each other and they're blinded by the love and they don't see any bad in anybody else and each other. And sometimes it could last 1 year, sometimes 10 years, sometimes 50 years. It doesn't matter. But the point is, until you have the first fight, until the people fight for the first time, you have no idea if this relationship could survive tension. Could this relationship survive hardship? And maybe it's a very, very, very beautiful relationship, but there's no way to know how deep it is. So right in the beginning, according to the Medrash, right in the beginning, God is signaling to the Jewish people that this relationship is not just a relationship. God loves us because we're so beautiful and we're so loyal. It's much deeper than that. And this relationship could survive and will survive the ups and downs, the tension, the sadness, the separation, even the betrayal. And that's why, and that's the story. So when I talk about the portion 2 weeks ago of Kitisa, people say it's the story of the golden calf. It's not the story of the golden calf. It's the story of the forgiveness. It's the story of the second tablets. It's the story of the rehabilitation of the relationship. So in that sense, in a way, at least from God's perspective, from a spiritual perspective, it was almost inevitable because there's going to be separation and disappointment in any relationship. Maybe betrayal is an extreme example of that, but there's always going to be some tension and some disappointment and some betrayal. And the model that we see from our relationship with God is that that's okay in the sense that we could survive it and maybe not even survive it, but maybe that will actually intensify the relationship and make it more permanent. And maybe we have to build a home now. We have to signal, we have to testify, not just to other people, but also to ourselves and also to God that both of us want this relationship. So maybe if the Jewish people would not have sinned, maybe there would not be a temple. Now, I know it sounds a little radical, there would definitely be a temple in Jerusalem, because as soon as the Jewish people cross the sea, they sing the song of the crossing of the sea, and they mention the Mishkan, Mikdash. They mention the temple that they're going to build in the place that God chooses. So the temple was always in the plan, but the temple wasn't built till many, many years later. The temple wasn't built till 800 years, until 400 years after the Jewish people entered the land of Israel. But the idea that right now, even in a permanent, even in a temporary state, even when we're traveling, even before we conquest, even before we settle the land of Israel, even before we choose a capital, hundreds of years before all of this happens, we must have a home. Some people believe that's a result of the sin. So because there was this separation, now we have to go the extra mile and prove to ourselves and prove to God and prove to the rest of the world that God has forgiven us. And this relationship is something that God desires, and God wants to dwell in our midst. So that is the basic level, even before we get to the Kabbalistic notion. That's the basic level of the first word, Mishkan HaEdut, testimony of Mishkan of Testimony. What is the testimony? Testimony is forgiveness. So now it is boring. Why do I have to hear about every color paint or every color of the silver, of the gold, every detail of it, how this home is being built? It's not interesting. The answer is it's not interesting unless this is an expression of the love of God and the people. Then every detail becomes interesting. When people are in love, they talk about every detail, and they say, you're going to buy this flower, or that flower, you're going to put on this garment or that garment. Everything becomes significant because it's infused with this love and this connection. So that is step number one. Yeah, is this that you agree? Do you disagree, Bob? Am I just spinning this positive? Is this
No,
yeah, it's okay.
That flows for me. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, now we're going to go a little deeper and talk from the Hasidic angle and say, if you're saying that the Mishkan represents the atonement for the sin of the golden calf, it's not just the technicality of it, that we sinned and God forgave, and now we're going to build a home together. No. If you want to go a little deeper, you could actually say, philosophically speaking, that whatever the mistake of the golden calf is, whatever idol worship is, that philosophical mistake, building a temple is an antidote to that mistake. So it's not just a sign. Yeah, God, we sinned, God forgave us, and now God says, you know what? Let me rest in your midst to show that I really want to be here. It's much deeper than that. If you say the Mishkan is testimony, the Mishkan itself, the concept of the temple, the physical temple, is the antidote to idol worship. And now the question is, what exactly is the spiritual concept of idol worship, and how the temple is the antidote to the spiritual idea of idol worship. So that's the goal for the next few minutes. Okay, so the first question is, what would be the idea of idol worship? So the simple interpretation is idol is denial of God's existence. But if you look at the scripture, you look at the history, that wasn't really idol worship. The idol worshipers also believed that there is a God, and maybe that there's a God that may be the prime mover and maybe the ultimate power. These are all ideas that idol worshipers believed in. What they didn't believe in, what they believed is, and different forms of it, but if you want to generalize, is essentially that God maybe starts the process of creation, but at some point God abandons the world. In other words, abandons the world to nature. Whatever they thought, the stars or the constellations or the sun and the moon. And all of a sudden, yes, there is a God, but God sort of outsourced the operation of the world to the forces of nature. And therefore, if you want to succeed in this world, you have to align yourself with the forces of nature. And God is, yes, he's an abstract concept, but God exists somewhere in the beginning, but there's a dichotomy, there's a separation between God and the natural world. And therefore, God and everything God represents, which is morality, it doesn't really play out in the physical world. And the physical world, if you want to be successful, you have to align with the physical forces. So if you really go back to it and say what essentially is idol worship, why idol worship? Idol worship is creating a separation between the physical and the spiritual. Idol worship is saying that yes, there is a spiritual entity, maybe, in other words, at the core of everything, but it's separate and removed from the practical world. The practical world, if you want to be successful, you have to look for the physical forces. You have to serve the sun, the moon, everything that's tangible, and everything that can be seen and felt. And that's why every force of nature, the rain, the wind, every force of nature has a god, has an idol that has a physical object that represents this force of nature to show that we have to align ourselves with the physical power because that's reality. And maybe the spiritual concept of godliness is maybe it exists, but it's abstraction, it's separate, it's not involved in the physical world. So essentially what we're saying is idol worship represents the separation between godliness and creation. And it's a celebration of creation and realizing and believing that the ultimate power is separate and apart and disinterested from the being expressed in the physical world. So that is idol worship. So what's the antidote of idol worship? The antidote of idol worship is, and that's why you can take a piece of gold and you could say the piece of gold, you say, this is God. What do you mean this is God? You think the piece of gold created you? That's nonsense. But what they're saying is this piece of gold represents the power in this world. In this world, what's currency? What do people value? What's meaningful? So maybe there's a different plane where spirituality is meaningful, but right now we worship something that is tangible, that everybody can see, that is real, that can make a difference in the real world. So you have a piece of gold and you're serving the piece of gold. What are you saying? You're saying this represents power in this world. Okay. What's the antidote to idol worship? Antidote to idol worship is if you could understand that this physical piece of gold actually is not separated from God, but is actually an expression, it could be an expression of connection to God. In other words, if you take something physical and you use it consistent with the will of God, what you're doing here is now there's this severing between physical and spiritual, which is idol worship, and now you are connecting or sewing or tying or connecting the physical and the spiritual, and then that's the antidote of idol worship, where the stone is not a contradiction to the existence of God, or the gold is not a contradiction to the power of God, claiming that it is the ultimate power. Rather, it's an expression of the will of God. What does God want? God wants you to take the physical and use it for a holy purpose, for a spiritual purpose. So if you think about it that way, when you say that the Mishkan is a testimony that God forgave the people for the sin of the golden calf, it's not just, it's a sign that God wants to be in our midst, that too, but it's a little deeper than that. It's now we show how we can create a home for God out of the physical, not just a home for God, in other words, a place where we can study and meditate and become spiritual. No, it's that this physical, we take physical objects and we line them up in a certain way, and we say, here, this is where God wants us to dwell. So what's really happening here is we're saying that every single physical thing in the world that could be used as a vessel to express the holiness of God, and that is the antidote to idol worship. Because idol worship, again, is the separation and the forgiveness and the atonement and the correction, and the antidote to the idol worship is that the physical is not a contradiction to holiness, it is a vehicle to express holiness. So it's a fine line. And I just want to say that the Medrash talks about this, that they brought the gold to the temple to make the golden calf, and to atone for that, now they're bringing the gold to make the tabernacle, to make the home for God. So we see that it's the same problem. The same gold could be used for idol worship, or the same gold could be used to make a home for God. So that gold itself is not the problem. It's the question is, how do I view the physical? Do you view it as separate from and apart from God? And then if I do so, then very quickly I will fall into idol worship. I start worshiping the physical. Or I could understand that the physical is just a means, just a tool to create a home for God. And we don't just mean the physical home that they built in the temple in Israel, in the desert, but we mean essentially every physical thing could become a vehicle to express the will of God, kindness, goodness, and that's the antidote to idol worship. So that's point number one. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. I think it may fold into the idea of antidote to idol worship, but is it also like building Mishkan together is antidote to to any, or remedy rather, to any breakup in the relationship and betrayal?
So that's very interesting. You're saying that the word that it's not something that one person could do, it's a community. Right? There are there are two parshas this week. It's a double portion, the last two portions of the book of Exodus. I started talking about the second portion, pikude, which means the numbering, the mentioning, the counting the numbers. But the first parsha is Vayakel. Moshe gathered everybody together to tell them the commandment to build the tabernacle. And there's an interesting word, kahal, and Rabbi Jonathan Sachs wrote about this, and they put it out in the email this week, that kahal means congregation, and there's different words for in Hebrew for congregation, but one is kahal. Kahal means congregation, community. So in other words, it's something that cannot be done alone. And that's also the idea of connection. We talk about this, that the when you get to the soul level, the closer you get to the level of soul, the more all people are one, right? What divides us is the physical. The soul really unites us. So if you're going to say we're going to make a congregation, we're going to take 10 people, put them in the room, and well, all of a sudden we have a congregation. So what happens? So what is the mechanism? So if you just look at ourselves as bodies, then we're always separate. We can't really unite. And the real unity is only possible when you think about this, you get to the soul level, and the soul level, we are all actually one anatomy. So in that sense, I think that you're right, that the concept of idol worship is severing. It's severing between the physical and the spiritual. But the moment you're going to celebrate the physical, the more you're going to celebrate the physical, the more divisiveness you're going to have. Because when you look at the physical, we are different. The bodies are different. The bodies are distinct, and what you have separates me from what I have. From what you have separates you from me. What I have, I have this, you have that. We're different. The more physical you become, the more separation, and the more things break up into details. And the more soul you become, the more connected to your soul, the more you see the unity. So you can see a bunch of people in a room together, and you can see each person as separate because each person has their own distinct physical entity. But if you go deeper, the deeper you go, and the more you see we're really one and the same. What do we really want? And the deeper you go, you see we're more and more similar. And if you get to the soul level, we're not necessarily similar because every soul has its own makeup, just like every body has its own makeup. But the point is, we're part of one entity. All souls are one anatomy. So I think that you're right. The more physical you become, the more it's not physical or spiritual. It's what is your focus, right? We talk about this in Tanya in chapter 32, where he talks about the idea to love your fellow Jew and love your fellow as yourself, whether or not that's even possible. So if you choose to identify yourself primarily as your body, then you're never going to be able to love your fellow as yourself. But if you choose to identify yourself, how do I view myself? I view myself as my soul, and I view the other person as their soul. Then it's much easier to come to the mitzvah of love your fellow as yourself, because it's possible, because on the soul level, we are one. We all have a body, we all have a soul, but it's up to us what perspective, what are we choosing to look at, what are we choosing to focus on? And in general in life, the more physical, the more the physical we look at, the more idol worship, okay, but let's just not call names. Let's say the more separation, more distinction. And the more spiritual we look at, the more spirit, the more we tap into the spiritual side of life, the more connection you're going to find.
Yes, thank you. But that's very important point on the communal level, but also because Torah is a lesson for us in all areas of life. Is it also true in the personal relationships that taking on a project together will be an antidote to any betrayal or something?
I think so. I don't think I think on the first level that's the expression. In other words, if we're willing to do a project together, that means we want a relationship. Right? In other words, you can't build a temple, you can't build a home with somebody that you can't tolerate. It's not going to work, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that we have, there's also a teaching, the teaching is also, and the problem is there's a crisis. Once the project is over, there's a crisis. There's many ways to think about this, but when a project is over, is a crisis. Just jumping to a different topic. You go to the first generation of pioneers who built the state of Israel, and they were very committed, and they were very willing to sacrifice to build a new state. Okay. And then you have the second generation in the 60s, and they were asking themselves, what are we sacrificing for? In other words, the project has already been built. So you can't, now you ask yourself, the project is built. So why do I have to live here? Why can't I go and live in a place that's more comfortable? So in other words, when there's a collective building project and people that generates commitment. But when you don't have that, then then you have to start asking, why am I here? All I'm trying to say is that yes, the building of the project itself is what forms community, right? Vayakhel, kahal. So what happens first, the chicken or the egg? Were they a community and therefore they can build a temple? Or does the act of building a temple create a community? If you see what I'm saying.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I think that. Now I can go into your own self. If you want to think about this in your person's own life, that you have, the more person has to do many different things and wear many different hats, certainly in the modern world. And you have a lot of technical things you have to do in order to be able to see, to achieve what you want to achieve. And some of the things you enjoy more and some of the things you enjoy less. And hope maybe you can outsource some of the things you enjoy less, but you can't outsource everything. And you look at your day and there's a lot of fragmentation. And some people think that fragmentation leads to burnout. In other words, I have to do all these kinds of things, which is not aligned with exactly with my goal, with what I want to do, but there's sort of sub points, there's sub things that I have to do in order to do something else. So you can look at the day and see many different details that are fragmented, but that's from a physical perspective. If you look at the soul of the event, then you really could see, perhaps you can get in touch and see the unity within all the things you're doing. So in other words, if you say, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Because this allows me to achieve something tomorrow. Okay, so maybe you could see how this thing is not just a technicality, but it's part of a bigger picture, right? I have to take out the garbage. I have no interest in taking out garbage, right? So this is a fragmented event that's just a distraction to what I really want. What I really want is peace, serenity, connection, right? So that's viewing it. You can view this technicality. I have to go and do this and clean the garden or whatever else I'm doing, but that's just housework. But the same thing, house maintenance. But the same thing is with at work. I have my ultimate goal, and then I have details that I would prefer not to be doing. And if you look, that creates fragmentation because you're looking from the physical, from the external perspective. But if you look at a more spiritual perspective or inner perspective and say, why am I doing this? What does this do? Essentially, it's part of a greater story. And if it's part of a greater story, you could see the unity and you could see the passion and the excitement of the big idea, because the big idea is exciting, but you can tap into that excitement even when I'm dealing with a specific detail, which seems to be unrelated to the big idea on the surface, but that's only on the surface level, on the body level. If you go to the soul level, you could see that this event is part of the big idea, right? I'm standing in line to buy a potato for in Whole Foods. That's not exciting. But if I could see that this is actually part of the challenge that I'm going to have on Shabbos and we're going to celebrate together with friends and family, and I could sense some of that energy while I'm standing in line with the potato, then it's no longer a fragmented event. It's part of a greater event that I really enjoy. Now, to be able to see the detail as part of the whole, I have to sort of look at the soul of the event, not just what it looks like on the surface, but I have to dig a little deeper. So this concept is true on many different levels. This concept is true on many different levels. What they all have in common is the more physical I get, the more fragmentation I get, the more separation I get, the more spiritual I get, the more unity. And that becomes unity within, like I said, with it, connecting the physical and the spiritual. That's the antidote to the golden calf, is by saying that any piece of gold that yesterday was a distraction, yesterday was an idol, yesterday was saying that I am the most powerful thing and I'm desirable and I'm worth worshiping. In other words, one way to think about this, I am the end. I'm not a means to an end. And all of a sudden now it becomes a means to an end. It becomes a means to an end. It's not an idol. Okay, so that's the big idea. I think we'll stop here, but I want to just say one more thing that I heard from Rabbi Shais Tab, and I said it in the past, but I think it's very beautiful. And he talked about idol worship, modern view of idol worship. And he says like this, and I think this is thought-provoking. I think this is interesting. He says like this. He says, what is idol? What is God? What is an idol? Is you're replacing something for God. What is God? God is something that exists by its own right. God exists because it exists. You can't explain, or you don't have to explain why it's here. It is because it is. God always exists. It's I mean, the language of my mom is, it's the Mechuyev HaMetzius. God must exist. It's the true existence. Everything else doesn't have to exist. Everything else is dependent on the existence of God. But God is the only thing that exists on its own right. Okay, so let's say I say, I ask myself, what do I want? And I want all kinds of things, but why do I want them? I keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. I say, why do I want this? Why do I want to be comfortable? Why do I want to be healthy? Why do I want to earn money? Let's say the answer is happiness. Okay, I want to be happy. Okay, that's legitimate. That's legitimate. I want to be happy. Okay, now I say, why do I want to be happy? If the answer is, I want to be happy just because, that's the goal. I want to be happy. I don't have to explain why I want to be happy. So if that's the goal, then happiness is my idol. Happiness is my God. Because God is the thing that must exist. It doesn't have to be explained. It doesn't have a source. It is because it is. So everything I do is because I want to be happy. So now I worship happiness. Now, worshiping happiness is a great thing, except that it could also be very dangerous, because if the ultimate goal is happiness, then I could do some negative things to attain this happiness, or immoral things to attain this happiness. So it's a little bit dangerous to say, I want to be happy because I want to be happy. I don't have to explain it. By the way, happiness, but it's anything else. I want to be comfortable. Why do you want to be comfortable? So if I keep saying I want to be comfortable, that's my goal. Everything I do is so I should be comfortable. And I say, well, why do I want to be comfortable? If I cannot explain that, I just say I want to be comfortable because I want to be comfortable. That's my God. That's my idol. That's my God. And that could be dangerous, because I could do some certain things that I could do things that are immoral in order to be comfortable. So what does it mean not to serve idols? Not that I don't want to be happy. I want to be happy. Not that I don't want to be comfortable. I want to be comfortable. I want to be healthy. I want all the desirable traits, but I don't want them for their own sake. Why do I want them? I want them so that I could fulfill my purpose, so that I could serve God, so that I could fulfill the purpose of my soul descending into this body. All of a sudden, this same value of happiness or being comfortable or seeking peace, all these values are serving a higher value. And what's the higher value? God. So ultimately, what is your God means, what is the ultimate purpose of existence for you? And that every physical thing could be a vehicle, a tabernacle, a home to express the deeper truth, the deeper spiritual connection to God. And that is the antidote to idol worship. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was very meaningful, very much needed in today's world, but also emphasizes the importance of having a big picture in mind, having a goal in mind, and that goal being serving God, making God happy. And if that is lost, then all the little details just fall apart and don't make any sense.
Right. And also sometimes they're contradictory, because a lot of things we do are contradictory. I have to be present for my children. I also have to go work. I also have to be here, be there. I have to please my boss. I have to please my grandmother. This all of a sudden I'm being pulled in all these different directions. But if there's a story, if there's a goal, what am I trying to create? Then these concepts then there's a unity. There's a certain unity and serenity that comes with it. Now, I just want to say one thing before I take Bob's question, is what I meant to talk about, but I didn't talk about, is that right in the beginning of the parasha, it talks about Shabbos. Every time we talk about temple, the Torah mentions Shabbat. And the idea is that temple is the holiness of space, and Shabbat is the temple of time. So in other words, it's the same thing. What is the purpose of the 6 days of the week? ultimately it's to Shabbat. I'm working a whole week so I could connect to what's really important in life, and that's Shabbat. That's my family, that's my faith, that's my friends, this is my soul. So we are building temples, and the temple, there's the physical temple that was in the desert in Jerusalem, but there's also a temple in time. And that's just as important to cultivate that time where everything I'm working toward, say, what am I doing this for? I'm working so I could provide for my family. But when do I spend time with my family? Right? So you have to understand what is the vision, what is the goal, and the goal is what is the serving. And the 6 days a week are serving the Shabbat, the connections and the bond and the getting in touch with the deeper part of life, which we do on Shabbat. Go ahead, Dr. Bob, please.
Actually, Rabbi Sachs, in his weekly drash, may God bless his memory, mentioned that about Shabbat and the tabernacle exactly. But my question really is, if really what we are put here for is service of God, where does the joy come in? Is it a spiritual joy that we're doing, that we have a connection to God, or is it joy in the corporeal, in the here and now?
It's both in the here and now. But why is the here and now joyous? Because it's meaningful. There cannot be joy without meaning. There could be pleasure without meaning, but there cannot be joy without meaning. We could talk about joy, but joy is the transcendence. Joy is I'm in the here and now, but I'm part of a larger story. There cannot be joy. There cannot be joy in, if you talk about this idea of the physical is separation and joy and spiritual is connection. Joy is always about connection. It's almost impossible to be joyous alone. When you're really happy, you want to connect to other people that you love or even strangers. If you're really happy, you'll walk into a place and you just dance with strangers. And certainly if you're really happy, you'll want to connect with people that you love. When a person is sad or melancholy, I want to be alone. I don't want anyone else I don't want to talk to anybody else because God forbid, if I talk to you, you're going to make me happy and I don't want to be happy. So joy is different than pleasure. Pleasure is its own idea. We could talk about pleasure another time, but pleasure could be done. But pleasure doesn't have to necessarily be connected to meaning, but joy must be connected to meaning. There is no joy without meaning. And therefore, it's not a contradiction. Yes, most people, in other words, we're not talking about just spiritual pleasure. We're talking about the physical pleasure, but the physical pleasure connected to a spiritual goal. And it's a very important point because both on Shabbat and on holidays, it talks about a person has to be joyous and have pleasure in the physical sense. You have to eat good food and you have to have joy. And the Talmud says, how do you have joy? This is a crazy statement. You cannot be joyous without meat and without wine. Say, what? That's joy? Joy is study Talmud, study Kabbalah. That's exciting. Sing a song. No, but that's exactly what you were alluding to, Doctor, which is the point of joy is not to escape. The point is joy is connection. And connection is connecting the physical, the here and now, with the transcendence with God. So joy, the short answer is joy person cannot have joy without meaning. It's not just the meal. It's the meal is telling me a story. The meal is the connection that's here. It's not just the meal. You could have pleasure. You can have pleasure without meaning, but you cannot have joy without meaning.
Beautiful. Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you all for joining.
Shalom.
And we're finishing the book, so that's exciting. And the bottom line is we should find the connection, the spiritual connection and the soul in everything we do. And everything we do is indeed building a home for holiness. So thank you.
Chazak u'baruch.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Oren. Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, Bob.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.